Oh, you need, okay, got it, got it. Okay, great. Uh, okay, we'll flip that in. We have time in between, so we'll work that out. So these are 30-minute talks, but we'll probably go mostly up to that, and then there's a few minutes at the end for Q&A. That sounds good. Yeah, questions. Yeah, or it's hard to, what would you prefer? I think it's better for questions. Questions that you kind of roll. I mean, when it just ends, and people will have questions. And the other thing too is, if there's insanity, if there's a lot of joint questions, we might just cut it at like 5 minutes or something, just to give this time. So we, if you want to take a look at that, great, great. Hi, hey, good to see you. Is that, oh, sorry. We can put the other one down below if you want.
I think it's fine like that.
Okay.
That
You want to
seems
slide down?
maybe it's better.
I just want to be safe.
Perfect. Okay. Yep.
Just gotta do some altering real quick. Yeah, I gotta still alter some stuff.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Thanks.
Alrighty, let's see. Let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome you to the second day of Track C, Data Science Track here at Spark Summit. Thank you very much for coming here to the track. It's my pleasure to introduce Kevin Matter, who is a lecturer at ETH Zurich, also the founder of 4Quant, and here to talk about real-time image processing with Spark. Thank you.
So thank you for that introduction, and I'll start my talk now. So the title is Scaling Up Fast Real-Time Image Processing and Analytics Using Spark. So in terms of an outline for what we're going to do today, it's going to sort of be imaging in 2014, which will cover a little bit of what we saw during Jeremy's keynote talk earlier, and then how we scale imaging up, scaling sort of the post-processing and analysis as well, and then looking at how this applies to real-time imaging and what sort of resources are required to keep up with the flood of information we have, and then sort of beyond. So what do we do next once we've solved these more basic problems with image processing? And so the goal of what we're trying to do is to really have a modern image analysis infrastructure to make these complicated problems and analyses very easy, and to kind of handle the flood of data that comes from the instruments we have now and is capable of handling future instruments which will produce data even faster than we currently get it. So as sort of a look in imaging in 2014, with the constant improvement in detectors and light sources, imaging has gotten much quicker in the recent years. You know, light sheet microscopy, like was talked about in the keynote, can produce images at 500 megabytes a second or more. Synchrotron-based X-ray tomographic microscopy, which I'll explain in the next slide, can make images at over 1,000 frames a second and 8 gigabytes a second of data, which is really an incredible volume to try to deal with. High-speed confocal images can now be over 200 frames a second, which is then 78 megabytes. And there's really many other examples from MRI and other fields of just very high volumes of image data coming in. And the problem with this is that the images are only as good as what you can do with them. And so earlier, if you sort of look at this graph, which is adapted for one that was made for genome biology, because that's another field that's seen some rapid transitions in how fast you can acquire data, you can see that sort of the breakdown between experiment and measurement, so these kind of first two tabs here, the red and the blue, has shifted drastically. And so now you spend very little time with the measurements themselves and then a huge amount of time managing the data and then post-processing it. And so it really changes the way you have to work with these problems because it takes you 6 months to analyze 3 seconds worth of measurements. And that really is not a very good balance for discovering as many things as you can. So to briefly talk about synchrotron-based X-ray tomographic microscopy. It's a very specialized technique that uses X-ray radiation to look inside samples. And so it's one of the only techniques that can sort of do all of these following because of its ability to penetrate deep into samples. And so, as you saw with the zebrafish keynote before, they could look at zebrafish because they were transparent, but they couldn't look at mice because the light doesn't go deep enough. So you can just look at the top layer. And with X-ray microscopy, you can actually go all the way through the sample because the X-rays penetrate. You can get very high spatial resolution, so lower than 1 micrometer with 1.8 millimeter field of view, which means you can see sort of single cells in your sample. You can get above 10 hertz of temporal resolution, so you can get 3D data 10 times a second in your sample, and 8 gigabytes a second of images. And then here are 2 movies. For whatever reason, that one doesn't work. For sort of how tomography itself works, you have the sample here. This is a bone, which is rotated 180 degrees, and you then capture these projection images. And so I'll show it again, where you have these images on the right, which are being sort of the light that goes through the bone, and you get a shadow, like the X-ray you get at a hospital. You can then use filtered back projection and other techniques to reconstruct it into a bunch of slices, so a stack of images that you need to look at, and then do the segmentation and post-processing to get the 3D structures out of these stack of images. So for an idea of kind of the typical large-scale projects that we're trying to work on, one of them is a zebrafish phenotyping project, which is a collaboration with a number of different PIs from different institutes, and that's trying to look at thousands of different samples imaged at a very high resolution where you get 20 to 40 gigavoxels per sample. And so that's a huge number of points to try to deal with. And so when you see, you can get sort of 3D scans through a sample like this, and it's a ton of information to process. And so what you want to be able to do with these data sets is identify single cells, look at the cellular networks and connectivity, classify the cells into different types. So these are, liver cells or muscle cells, and then sort of register it with other types of imaging so you can see where diseases are, or maybe track how fast the animal's growing to understand much better what the genetic background of these animals is doing to the final animal that you see. A similar scale project that we're working on in Switzerland is sort of the brain project, where we're trying to measure sort of a whole mouse brain. And so that's basically 1 cubic centimeter scanned at 1 micron resolution. And so that's 1,000 gigavoxels of data. And so with this, we want to be able to register separate scans together so that we can compare brain structures, particularly as things evolve or change, and then be able to quantify things about the vascular network and other imaging modalities. So in terms of the imaging goals we have, sort of the current state is there's many, many image processing tools available. Some tasks are easy, some are very difficult, and much of the code is sort of highly optimized. So it's written for GPUs so that it's very performant on one machine, but as soon as your GPU runs out of memory, it stops working. And so kind of the issues we have are with this GPU, with RAM, with optimized code, which is very unreadable or untestable because it's written for this one specific application and it's very well sort of compacted for that, but it's difficult to figure out what's going on. Each problem is sort of a little bit different. And I would say the biggest issue we have here is that the scientific questions don't really equal the software packages. And so what you are trying to find from your data is rarely a button you need to click in this program. You need to sort of explore and compare many different things, and that's currently not very difficult in these pre-made tools. And so kind of looking at what we need, or imaging scientists need, is it needs to be able to handle small data sets very quickly so you can get feedback on your results to see what are in your experiments to see what's going on. It needs to handle sort of larger data sets in a reasonable amount of time so that you can get these analyses done without having a 6-month backup of data. And it needs to scale to enormous sample sizes, so significantly larger than what would ever fit in a single computer's memory. And then, of course, because we're scientists, we don't program very much, and so it needs to be relatively simple, so not much more difficult to use than Python or MATLAB, where you can write one base one program and have it run on your own computer, on the cluster, on the cloud, and work identically so that you don't need to worry about all these other complicated issues. It sort of needs to be testable, and it would be nice if you could just add computers in to get more computational power. So going back to sort of existing tools, because before you jump to sort of a completely new platform like Spark, you need to be quite sure that there's nothing available now that does what you need. And so usually they have a very friendly GUI, so you can interact with them easily. They're optimized. They scale well up to about a gigavoxel, but they tend to do very poorly above that point. And sort of the negatives, which have been the negatives for many different platforms, is if one machine crashes, everything crashes, and so they're very unstable for large data sets or cluster computing. It's tedious to get these programs to do many data sets exactly the same way. Arrays, which are sort of the commonly used structure for 3D data or image data, don't handle multi-channel data very well. And so if you have an array and you want to have a color image, so each channel is a different color, you then need to have 3 arrays. If you then have spectral data, you need to have hundreds of arrays. And so it's very difficult to do analyses with data structured in that format. And implementing new algorithms tends to be very difficult, because if you want it to run on the GPU, you have to write specialized code for that. If it runs on the CPU, you have to have something special for that, and you need many libraries, and so it's sort of tedious to use. And extracting sort of specific metrics where you're trying to kind of explore your data is typically pretty difficult. And checkpoints. So I would say kind of the biggest problem we have with this is that you don't ask the questions you should, you ask the questions you can, which sort of goes back to the scientific questions is not software packages. And so if you have a specific tool like Excel or any other tool, you do analyses that Excel is capable of doing, not the analyses you're actually interested in to understand your samples. And so you need a tool that doesn't limit your imagination when you're trying to explore these data sets. And so most of these tools make it very difficult to kind of play around or explore with what you're doing. None of them are very robust or sort of deal with streaming or flooding in data. And 8 gigabytes a second is really a huge amount. And so it's 3 times as many images as Instagram gets a day, at least as of, I think, a couple months ago. But it's a very large amount of data, and so to be using one computer with some off-the-shelf package is probably not the right solution. So to kind of make the connection between this and machine learning, imaging problems, or kind of imaging science in general, tends to be sort of a machine learning type problem, or there's many similarities between them. And so you kind of have these inputs for your samples, which are the genetic background, sort of the composition you're using to make up your sample, and things like environment. So if you do have a treatment you're doing to these animals that you're looking at, or samples that you're looking at, if you have different temperatures or mechanical testing, that all sort of factors into your input, and then you put it into this imaging box, and you get many of these outputs out. So cell count, shape, distribution, thickness, structural parameters. In the case of other modalities, you get functional imaging, so are these neurons firing or not? And really what you want to do is you want to establish a relationship between these inputs and these outputs. So if you can understand how genetic background affects thickness, you can sort of establish a model for what's going on in your system and how you can tune the parameters in your final animal based on the model you've established. So it's really important for sort of decomposing these complicated systems into simple parts, and you just need to measure lots of data in order to have that. So here's an example from a phenotyping experiment we've did, where you have 2,000 bone samples here, you measure them and post-process them. In the same time, you take the genotypes of all these different mice, and then you sort of compare them together to figure out which genotypes are correlated with which structural parameters, like thickness, or the number of channels that are flowing through it, or the number of cells that you have. And so by taking these two pieces of information and studying them together, you can establish these correlations. So for the solution we came up to these problems, it's sort of a Spark imaging layer, and it was developed at sort of ETH Zurich and the Paul Scherrer Institute and 4Quant, and it's a flexible framework for image processing and testing, and so it sort of gives a modular design with these processing plugins that then go into analysis plugins and scale up to cluster or cloud scale computing systems, and give us the ability to do whatever analyses we want, because you can simply combine the tools as you like, and the ability to sort of do parametric assessments of our samples. So you can see how does changing some of the input parameters affect what you finally get out of the system. So in terms of performance on how well sort of Spark or Spark imaging handles our data sets, you can see these are some sort of simple tests that we've done with the number of cores and the voxels per second that these systems could handle, and it scaled very well up and beyond 50 cores. And then this is an analysis of sort of the overhead, so how much of the actual time, computing time was spent doing the computation, and how much was spent serializing data, sending things back and forth. And so we see with a lot of these that it's above 80%. And so that's a very good sign that these tools are working well and will handle our data sets fine. I mean, it's difficult to necessarily say what happens when the number of cores goes from 44 to 1,000, but at least for these size samples, it worked very well. So we do try to extrapolate a little bit to figure out how many nodes we would need to use to sort of keep up with the imaging data flood. And so, you know, with the samples we measure right now, about 1 scan a minute is as fast as we can realistically scan at the moment. And that, I think, falls at, yeah, I mean, so at one of these points. You see these curves, and these red lines represent sort of our different goal metrics. And you can see that with our current computing systems, we can handle sort of up to 0.067 scans a minute, which is better than, much better than we've had before, but obviously nowhere close to sort of the future of full 8 gigabytes a second coming in. And we see that even the Milky Way 2 cluster in China isn't quite capable of handling that. And that's assuming we can linearly extrapolate our current performance, which is rather unlikely. But at least we have sort of a potential solution to this problem, whereas before we had no idea how we would go about doing it. So in terms of real time with Spark streaming, and so before, as is very common with sort of scientific approaches, there are many, many different tools involved that are hacked together to get something to work. And it's functional, but if one part breaks, the whole thing falls down, and it's, you know, if you add one node, it won't automatically be integrated into the analysis, and it doesn't keep up with the current data rate. And so using Spark streaming, we can have sort of a 0MQ pipeline feeding the data from the camera into our analysis system, and then we can have a setup like this where we can use as many nodes as we need to keep up with the acquisition rate and the analysis. And, you know, if our data sets get larger, we just add more nodes. And if one node crashes, it continues running just slower than it was before. And so using these kind of tools enable us to keep up, or will enable us to keep up much better with the rates that experiments happen at. So going beyond image processing, so kind of an important choice when you choose an analysis tool is how flexible is this tool for what you're doing in the future. And so the first tests we had were just kind of the image processing and segmentation and analysis. But one of the major things that's done with these data after you've done that are sort of simulations. And so for the example of sort of a finite element analysis, that's actually very closely mapped to what's being done with projects like GraphX. And so you have a graph and you have these connections, between the different nodes, and you measure the forces across these nodes in order to figure out if this point is moving or not. And so with this, we can just immediately move all of our data into GraphX and do these kind of analyses with the same cluster and the same tools without rewriting everything or importing and exporting the data again. Similarly, for other types of simulation, so for cell growth, there's a tool called the cellular POTS model, which is used to model sort of how tumors grow or how cells divide. And this is a similar sort of technique where you can use this GraphX approach to create the network from your imaging data and then study how these networks change with time by applying these relatively simple rules to each node. And so you see that for sort of a standard data set, the number of elements we would have would be around 14 billion, and there'd be 378 billion edges. And so it'd be quite a complicated problem to solve, but we just input it into Spark and GraphX, and it figures out how to do all the really difficult tasks of partitioning the data across different nodes and making sure it's fault tolerant and everything else. Whereas if we try to write a code base ourselves, we spend 90% of the time figuring out what happens at the edges between two partitions and how you synchronize data back and forth, and that's really not problems we're good at solving. So in terms of kind of beyond, as I think some of the presentations yesterday mentioned, they have this BlinkDB, which is coming out of MLlib, and that's actually even more interesting for us because with a lot of image processing tasks, you usually downsample to make your analysis go faster. But that's, of course, only a kind of approximation of your structure. And you lose lots of information when you do this downsampling. And if you use a tool like BlinkDB, you can get results quicker without making such kind of a brute or a blunt downsampling. You can just have BlinkDB decide which ones are important or which ones can be computed quickly, and you can get your result much faster without resorting to these tools. And so it will give you a much quicker result without losing as much information, or you can control how much information you lose in your setup. And particularly for things like filters on images, if you're just trying to blur your image out, you probably don't need all of the neighbor pixels, you just need a couple of them. And so that would be a result that could be done very quickly without necessarily downsampling. So in terms of kind of a reality check for how all this Spark stuff works, it's not perfect, and I would even say it's not very performant. And so, dedicated optimized CPU and GPU codes have, at least in our experience, wildly outperformed Spark when run on a single node. And so we won't be able to match the performance of these CPU and GPUs with Spark without having many more computers. But using Spark makes your life much easier. And so it's sort of a trade-off you have to be ready to accept. Particularly with our imaging data, we had lots of issues with serialization overhead because in order to send these data blocks back and forth, they need to be serialized every time. And it works well until you sort of saturate your network, and then it works very poorly. So when you're sending so much data back and forth constantly across the network, it can be a problem, and it actually starts to affect other people using your system for other tasks. And so that was also less than ideal. But to sort of end on a good note, Scala, Python, and Spark is substantially easier to write and test than any of these CPU or GPU codes. Human time, at least in Switzerland, is 400 times more expensive than AWS time. And so I think that's a very important factor, that every extra minute you spend debugging GPU code, you could have had 6 hours on Amazon's cloud. And mistakes due to sort of poor testing can be really fatal. And so if you aren't sure your code's doing the right thing and you analyze several thousand samples, it's difficult to go back and reanalyze them again. And so with Spark, or with Scala, you can have very simple codes that are very easy to look at and check, where the C++ codes can be a disaster to try to figure out what's going on. And Spark is hardware agnostic, and so you don't need to worry about drivers or vendor lock-in, and to get it running on Amazon or your own cluster is very easy. So Spark is a very flexible solution for these large image processing tasks, and sort of these coarse-grained operations require quite a bit of rethinking, and so all the standard image processing algorithms you've seen don't directly apply to using sort of functional programming-based solutions, but it's sometimes a good thing because a lot of these old algorithms are very painful to work with. Yeah. There's, of course, bottlenecks, but I don't think they're game killers. I think they just require a little bit more work with optimizing the Spark code, optimizing usage of CPU and GPU resources when they're available. And I think that in the future, many of these performance issues will be sort of negligible, or hopefully they will be. So in terms of 4Quant, which is the company I mentioned at the beginning, what do? And so they sort of do image processing and analysis as a service. And so they'll do measurement analysis and statistical analysis of large image data sets. They'll set up image processing tools on sort of a cloud setup so that you can upload your data and do your analysis there. We develop custom analysis solutions. So if you have a very specific problem, we can combine our tools to come up with the information you're trying to extract from these images. We do consulting on these sort of imaging tasks and education and training. And so some of our courses are even available online to go look and see or get an idea of how quantitative imaging works and what sort of information you can expect to extract. So for my acknowledgements, I'd like to thank the IT department at the institute I work at, Paul Scher Institute, the rest of the X-ray tomography group, which is called Tomcat, and we're interested in partnerships and further collaborations to make these tools better. So thank you. No, we haven't really looked at that. That's one of the very new things we're trying to do. We were just seeing now that we've adopted Spark, what other cool stuff can we do with it? And so maybe I assume actually there's many more optimized tools for doing these problems, but Spark just lets us have one framework where we don't need to switch programming languages and learn a bunch of new APIs every time. Because GraphLab or GraphX, when you're using Spark, is very easy to adopt. So.
There was a presentation yesterday about support for sparse matrices in the MLlib 1.0, and we talked a lot about how always it's going to be better from a storage perspective, and often from a computation perspective, it's going to be a lot more efficient.
Yeah.
Do the optimizations that you guys have incorporated already done incorporate sort of taking advantage of sparsity, or does the data that you work with not lend itself to that?
Well, so I was at that presentation. It was very interesting yesterday. I thought they did a good job. And one of the things he said at the beginning was that you sort of have your sparse data and then your noise on top of it, which then makes it not sparse anymore, which is what we have. And so we have sparse structures ideally, but you need to get the noise out first. And so the images we all acquire are very dense. And so it takes a very long time until we get to sort of this sparse state where we've cleaned out all of the noise and the artifacts in our images and have sort of the underlying structure we're looking at. Once we have that structure, we do store it in a sparse manner. So rather than storing a huge array, we store each point that's available, which makes many of the coding tasks simpler and is much, can be hundreds of times smaller for those data sets. So, yeah.
Is any of the stuff that you're working on open source? And if so, does it work with 2D imagery like satellite stuff? And then I have a follow-up question.
Yeah, so some of it is open source. I mean, we're moving in that direction. It's just we developed lots and lots of tools before that are closed source, and we're not necessarily going to open those up, but a lot of the new things we have are open source. And we even have, so as part of the course I had, and then as part of these slides, which I believe will be made available on the Spark Summit website, we have some sort of basic sort of how do you get started doing imaging tasks in Spark, where you see here, this is how you load an image and save it into this key value format. And then how can you do sort of simple tasks like performing a threshold on this data, looking at a region of interest, doing a box filter. And so what you see here is that a lot of this code, to do a box filter in MATLAB is very easy because you just use the function that's built in, but to write it yourself in C is much more complicated than this. And so Spark makes complicated tasks fairly easy. And when you run this code, it automatically runs on your cluster, your cloud, or whatever you have set up. You don't have to redo anything. So.
The follow-up to that is, you said that there's a lot of network overhead and congestion that can become a problem.
Yeah.
Is that because you're sending lots of images around, or are you working on individual pixels and pixel neighborhoods, and you're sending that around the network?
Right. So we're sending.
What's the unit of that you're working with?
So we're sending pixel neighborhoods across, and so with image processing, you always, or in most of the operations you do, it's not really a clean map-reduce modality, that you sort of have these neighborhoods you need to be worried about. So when you do a Gaussian filter, you need to look at all the pixels that are surrounding your current pixel, and so there needs to be information that's shared back and forth. And so it's sort of inherent to the problem that a lot of this data will need to be sent back and forth, and Spark, at the moment, with its partitioning, isn't as smart as it possibly could be, because you could save a lot of time if you're able to identify that these partitions are never going to move and these are the only ones that need to be sent back and forth. But right now, a lot of the partitions get sent back and forth that don't necessarily need to, and that creates, of course, extra overhead for us. So.
Do you inference in networks, like macro-prime fields,
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
graphical networks or image analysis in macro-prime fields? Do you use them in Spark?
No, we haven't used them at all in there so far. Sorry.
We can have a breakout in the back.
Okay, that's fine. Perfect.
Thank you very much. That's awesome.
So it's on GitHub. So if you go to forkmart, GitHub, you can find it.
Make sure it's like an HTML outside.
They're producing collaboration there.
Yeah.
Let's get your mic back here too. All right. Hi, it's my pleasure to introduce Evan Sparks, one of the forces of nature behind MLlib and MLbase, but here to talk about model search and model optimization. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. My name's Evan Sparks. Yeah, I really appreciate you guys had this summit in my honor. It's really flattering. It's crazy. I've never seen so many people with my name on their badges. No, but seriously. So I am a third-year graduate student at the AMP Lab at Berkeley. When I arrived at Berkeley, just as Spark was sort of starting to take off, and it looked like a really great platform to do my research, which is into large-scale distributed machine learning. So today I want to talk to you about Ghostface, which is the code name of the system that we've been working on to do large-scale distributed model search. So just a quick overview of the badass stack, and you've seen some version of this slide, presumably. Of course, at the center, Spark came out of the AMP Lab, and in particular, a lot of the research going on at the AMP Lab today is on building sophisticated analytics frameworks on top of this wonderful engine that is Spark. So Spark Streaming, Shark, and more recently Spark SQL, as well as GraphX and MLbase are all frameworks that we're developing on top of Spark in the lab. And then, and of course, in the open source community. So most of my work, again, is focused on this MLbase component, which I'll dive into a little more detail of. So what is MLbase? MLbase is a project designed to make distributed machine learning much easier. Easier for both developers, so that is people who are developing new machine learning algorithms at scale, and also people who are trying to use these things in their business pipelines and in their processes, trying to incorporate advanced analytics where normally they might be doing some sort of simple reporting. Somebody who suddenly wants a classification model where all they used to have were sort of OLAP rollups. So the stack of ML-based looks like this. So MLlib is the first component of the stack. It ships, of course, with Spark as one of the standard libraries. It's the standard library for machine learning. MLI is a experimental API designed to simplify the implementation of new algorithms and feature extractors and the kinds of machine learning goodness you would want on top of such a system. And then the ML optimizer is a declarative layer designed to give people the ability to sort of automatically kind of come up with these pipelines without needing to be absolute experts at machine learning. So MLlib and MLI, I'll give you a kind of a status update as to where those are in just a minute. But most of this talk, I'm actually going to talk about sort of this crazy research stuff that's going on top of these lower components of the stack. So MLlib and MLI. First, MLlib we released as a component of Spark 0.8. It was just a few of us in the lab working on this initially, and came out in I guess September. And since then, there's been unbelievable open source involvement in the project. 30 contributors to MLlib and Spark 1.0. There's been continued development in the AMP lab, but there's also been a lot of open source contributions. So things like decision trees and naive Bayes and SVD all came from open source community members. So that's been absolutely wonderful to see. MLI is this experimental API I mentioned, designed for developing machine learning algorithms. We described it in an ICDM paper last year. There's been continued development using MLI as a research platform at Berkeley. But I think more importantly, we've seen a lot of the ideas that were baked into MLI making their way into MLlib and Spark. So the model and algorithm abstraction that many of you are probably familiar with has been in there since MLlib 0.8. In Spark 1.0, we start treating matrices as sort of a first-class citizen and start supporting both sparse and dense data, side by side with very similar interfaces. This idea of what we called ML table, but now you start to see this come into other parts of Spark. So in Spark SQL, we have schema RDDs, which are basically RDDs with schema, relational tables. Something like a data frame in Pandas or R. Is starting to come into the Spark ecosystem, and that's really great to see. And this is another example, I think, of potential for multiple parts of the ecosystem really working together. So using Spark SQL tables as inputs to ML algorithms and feature extractors, for example, is something that I think makes a lot of sense. The next piece is sort of standardizing the interfaces, both for models and for parameters and so on. That's going in MLlib 1.1. And another feature that you will probably see in MLlib 1.1 is this idea of parallel model training. And I'll actually go into a little bit more depth about that in the talk in a moment. So what does it mean to construct a machine learning pipeline? So a simple machine learning pipeline starts with like this. You've got your data in a database or a data warehouse. Maybe it's on S3 or HDFS, something like that. You then do some feature extraction. You turn your data into feature vectors somehow through some process. And then you feed those features into some model training procedure. So fit an SVM or learn a decision tree. And then finally, you end up with some notion of final model. And this is the object that you can ship around and make predictions with as users click on things on your web pages or classify, hey, that's a bird in that image. And so this is the thing that you can use to sort of, make predictions. So in reality, though, constructing these pipelines is sort of a highly iterative procedure. So you have this, you'll evaluate your model, and suddenly, the error will be junk, and you'll realize you need to go back and add some new data. Maybe you need to try a different feature extraction procedure, or maybe you need to experiment with different kinds of model families. So maybe it's fitting an SVM instead of logistic regression or something like that. Fiddle with the hyperparameters that make the model work or not. So like I said, this is an iterative procedure, and our grand vision is to sort of automate the construction of these pipelines. So trying a bunch of different knobs to turn and so on is a very manual process and something that we think that the computer can automate pretty well. So, but that's kind of an impractical thing to do all in one shot. So we're starting with one aspect of this iterative procedure, this building these pipelines, and that is model training. So this is what we mean when we're talking about automated model selection or automated model search. So what are the different model families I should be trading off between, and what are the different knobs of those families I should be fiddling with? So just to give everybody a refresher on what I mean when I say training a model, fitting a model. Well, what I mean is estimating some statistical parameters that are useful for making predictions. So in practice, what this looks like is over my data set, I might compute some kind of delta to my model, my current model, and update it. So this is things like gradient methods and stochastic gradient descent. You also see a very similar kind of procedure when you're doing things like decision trees. So you compute some delta to the histograms and you update them. But this is sort of an access pattern. This is a bunch of sequential scans over the data in practice in order to fit a model that works pretty well. And so the math might be different between each of these model families, but that access pattern is something that we see over and over again. So in practice, what this means with Spark is, on a reasonably sized cluster, we can, take a few, tens of passes over our data and fit an SVM on 200 gigs of data on a 16-node cluster in maybe a couple of minutes. So that's kind of the number I would keep in mind, reasonably big data set, a couple minutes to fit a model. So the tricky part is that, as I mentioned, if we had only one, statistical procedure that we used to build models, maybe it was just, if we only knew about logistic regression, our task would almost be done. But in fact, we have a bunch of different reasonable classification models that we can use. So logistic regression, SVM, tree-based. There's a whole slew of acronyms that I could throw at you, and I won't. And then each of these algorithms also has a set of hyperparameters to tune. So these are those little knobs that make your model fitting just right or totally wrong. And actually setting these in practice is often fairly experimental. The other portion is this feature extraction and featurization. And again, that's not what the focus is today, but it's important as another dimension to keep in mind when you're building these pipelines. So maybe I should try different text features if I'm fitting a text processing pipeline. So n-grams, how big is the n? Or TF-IDF, how many terms do I go out when I'm fitting my text model? Similarly, for images, there are similar trade-offs to make. And then there are these sort of domain-independent trade-offs that you can make as well. So again, with model search, we're really focusing just on algorithms and hyperparameters for now. So how do you actually do this? So it turns out in practice, people are doing this all the time. And one approach is to sort of try it all. So I have on the right side of the slide here, two hyperparameters I might want to tune. Say learning rate and regularization for something like logistic regression, so L2 or something like that. And each of the points on this space represents a potential setting for the hyperparameters of this model. Maybe the best answer is learning rate somewhere and regularization somewhere in that lower right corner there. Now, in order to find that, I might actually have to try and fit several models. So I might try and fit a model in this corner and that point and that point and so on. And this is an approach called grid search. You can kind of imagine the nested for loops in your head sweeping over the space. And so eventually, I fill up the space and I get to a best answer, which is maybe, I try to point close enough to that best answer and I think that's pretty good, and I'm done. And so this is with 2 dimensions. You see how many red dots there are on my screen. You can imagine as you add dimensions to this hyperparameter space, that space starts growing exponentially and that volume gets really big really fast. And so, given that these models are expensive to train, perhaps there's a better way that we can train models in reality. So I'm going to propose a better approach, which is the one we study, which takes advantage of 3 basic optimizations. So first is better resource utilization through batching. So instead of training 1 model at once, I might train 4 or 10 models at a time. And you're going to see why we can do this almost for free. I'm going to talk about some algorithmic speedups. So instead of training every single model to completion, we take advantage of the fact that we know that model training is an iterative process and we can maybe stop some models early. So maybe some models don't get trained to completion and we can train more in the same amount of time. And I'm going to talk about sort of better search strategies. So instead of walking over this entire grid, maybe I can do something to get me to that best answer more quickly than the sweep. So for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to talk primarily about these 3 optimizations. So first is this idea of better resource utilization through batching. So the key idea here is that, at least in today's computers, processors are significantly faster than memory. And what I mean by that is that we can saturate the memory bus with something like 5 gigs a second per core. So that gives us, if we're streaming data into our processors through memory, we can read something like 500 million numbers per second. Meanwhile, we can probably do something like 15 billion flops per second per core. So that impedance that leads to this impedance mismatch where we have, for every number we read from memory, we could do maybe 25 numerical operations on it in the same time. So what does that mean for modeling? Well, a typical model update, one of these deltas I talked about earlier, basically requires something on the order of 2 to 4 flops per double. And this is going to vary depending on how complicated your model is, but for sort of the bread and butter ones, this is about what we see. So what that means is this, with this 25x impedance mismatch, we can do something like 7 to 10 model updates in the same amount of time that we could do by using otherwise idle cycles. And so this is pretty cool. It means that we can actually train maybe 7 to 10 models in parallel, while in the same amount of time we train one. Again, assuming that models are kind of small and fit in cache and we're not shuffling them back and forth in and out of main memory. And so what do we see when we actually implement this in MLI? Well, if we do it sort of the naive way, we see something between a 2 and 5x increase in models trained per second. So that is, for every data point we read in, we just update, say, anywhere from 1 to 10 models in parallel. And so 2 to 5x doesn't quite get us to the 7 to 10x that we would have hoped to see theoretically. And a lot of this comes from, the sort of typical JVM stuff, the unboxing, there's of course some network overhead and so on in there. But we basically see something like a 2 to 5x speed up for again, models that are sufficiently kind of small. It turns out that you can do this in a sort of more clever way with batch matrix updates. So we instead of doing our model updates as a series of basically dot products between vector dot products, we can turn this into matrix multiply and leverage all the crazy hard work that has gone into BLAS over the last 30 years and get cache aligned, nice, really fast, sort of dense multiplies that go faster than sort of the n-cube that you and I would code up natively. And so what we see when we turn on this matrix multiply operation, and you can kind of ignore the numbers at the top here because they were run on sort of on a slightly different cluster, but the speed ups at the bottom are what's important to focus on. So as we turn up this batching parameter, this batch size closer to 10, we really do see 7x speed up, again for sufficiently small models, but it works even better on larger models than the previous version. So there's still some stuff to do here. These are very early results. But the idea here is that if we can potentially train models in parallel. And in practice, this might be an important thing to do for a data science workflow. So the second optimization I want to talk about is algorithmic speedup. So how can we make this model search go faster? And so this is going to be, again, taking it into account this idea that each of the points in our hyperparameter space represents training a full model to completion. But it turns out that the models are trained by some iterative process. So what I've got on the right here is a graph that shows kind of error convergence for 2 different models. And you can see there's a model in blue, model B, that's not converging as quickly as model A. And if I gave each of these models some budget of, say, 10 passes or 100 passes through my data, I could say, just looking at it myself with some confidence, I don't think model B is ever going to get to the same answer as model A. So maybe we can just stop this thing early and kill it off when we realize that it's probably never going to converge. Now, the machine learning people in the room are probably cringing because how can I prove that this model is never going to get better than that model? And the answer is we can't, or at least we haven't yet. We are working on looking at this in sort of a more principled framework with multi-arm bandits. But the answer is that when we do it in practice, we actually get a significant savings in terms of like total passes over the data, total epochs, something like an 85% savings. And we converge to almost exactly the same answer. So we tried this on 5 different data sets with this early stopping heuristic turned off and then turned on. And we see that roughly 85% savings in terms of total passes over the data. And then what's the more important thing is that we get to almost the same answer as we would have if we had trained every model to completion. So we compare against a baseline on the right side and then the optimization turned off and then on the bottom here. So the answer is basically the same, despite maybe saving a bunch of potentially necessary work, I guess. So the other thing, there are lots of other things we can do to sort of accelerate convergence. So using fancier methods like accelerated gradient methods, AdaGrad or LBFGS, could speed up convergence quite a bit. These are things that LBFGS is now in MLlib, and we should just turn this thing on. So finally, the last bit of optimization I want to talk about here is improved search. So the question is sort of what search method should we use to go over this hyperparameter space? So it turns out that there are a lot of existing search methods for these, what we're calling derivative-free optimization problems. And that's not our word. That's something that's existed in the literature for years. But you can think of grid search and random search as versions of derivative-free optimization techniques. Basically, you're trying to find a minimum over some function that you don't know anything about the curvature of or whatever. I don't know what the derivative between decision tree and SVM is, for example. So all I can do is sample the function. I can get grid points, and now I want to converge to a global minimum very quickly. So grid search and random search, as I mentioned, are methods for this. Nelder-Mead and Powell's methods are things that have been around since the 60s. Simulated annealing is another one that falls into this family. And more recently, there's been some interest from the Bayesian community in this exact problem. And so 3 methods that are recent at NIPS, Spearmint, SMAC, and TPE, are things that we tried. And what we wanted to do here was compare, in this case, 7 different search methods across 5 different data sets. And I apologize, the chart is kind of confusing, but what we want to see is bars that are red. So on the left side, we have the fewer number of function calls in red, higher number of function calls, 15 up to, say, 600 in purple. And what we want to see are bars that get low very quickly. So what we see, interestingly, is that random search actually outperforms any of the sort of classical methods, which is surprising. How can random be that good? But a couple of the Bayesian methods anyway actually do slightly outperform random methods, so we went ahead and implemented them in our system. So putting it all together, we have the first version of the ML-based optimizer, and we wanted to, say, take a data set that would, say, 30 gigs of image features, run it on a 16-node cluster for a while, and compare do an ablation study of what turning these various methods for optimization on and off do. So basically, if you do the naive thing, grid search with none of these optimizations, you take something like 800 to 1,000 minutes to fit 128 models. Now, when you turn on both batching and this early stopping and use, say, TPE or the random search, you finish much faster. So something close to 100 minutes. And more importantly, I think, you converge to a pretty good answer very quickly by using one of these more sophisticated search strategies. So you get to a good answer within an hour, I guess, in these experiments, as opposed to potentially taking days of computation time, which is the difference between your lunch break and a weekend job running in a practical setting. So that's pretty exciting. So then the question is, of course, does it scale? Model search at scale, I guess, is the title of the talk. So the answer, yes, it scales. We run on a 1.5 terabyte data set on 128 nodes. This is thousands of passes over the data doing the search procedure, and we can get to a good answer within 11 hours, again, versus like what would be a week of time if we just did the naive thing. So that's kind of exciting. Okay, so I've given you an overview of kind of the work we've done on the model search pipelines. I think I have at least a few more minutes. So I want to talk a little bit about real-world pipelines. So this is sort of the future direction for our research. So earlier in the talk, I gave you this picture of a simple machine learning pipeline. So data to feature extraction to model training to final model. And that's kind of nice, and we focused just on what we could do if we really, we had all the degrees of freedom we wanted on this model training thing, and we could really search through it. So what does a real machine learning pipeline look like? Well, here's one that we coded up that looks a lot like, that's a sample image classification pipeline based on some work from Adam Coates and Andrew Ng back in 2012. And you can see that this starts to look a lot more complicated than that little 4 boxes that I showed you. In particular, we have this test area down on the bottom. We have a series of steps going on at the top. We have a second machine learning method, k-means, as part of the feature extraction pipeline. And then there's also this linear solver thing on the right side. And so it turns out that each of these boxes may or may not have its own hyperparameters to tune. So suddenly that search space of how do I find the model that actually works as a classification model given my data gets big very quickly. So things like how big is the convolution window, how big are my pools, what different polynomials do I apply to my data after I do the pooling step, again, which linear solver do I choose given my data. These are all things that the user would have to decide and that we hope to automate shortly. So that's the idea. We're working on a DSL in Spark, in Scala, to describe these pipelines. We have a few built. You can hope to see a release of this stuff from the MLlib by the end of the summer. So in future work, we're working on thinking about choosing between model families, so maybe looking at multi-arm bandits as a way of doing this. We're training lots of models together at the same time, so maybe there are some ensembling methods that we can use. So we're training all these models. We might as well use them and kind of use the insight they give us for free. We may want to leverage sampling, so it may not make sense to fit to your entire data set always. In practice, I've seen people take a subsample of their data, fit a model that kind of works, and then scale it up and apply it to the full, say 200 gig data set. Faster learning methods, again, incorporating these things like ADGRAD or LBFGS into the pipeline. Better parallelism for smaller data sets. So this is the idea that not all data is big data, but we can still leverage cluster resources in order to maybe train models faster. So maybe I broadcast my data out to all the nodes in my cluster, excuse me, all the nodes in my cluster, and train sort of local models there, and then come back and decide on what gives me the best result. Incorporating feature extraction into this pipeline, as I mentioned, is huge and is sort of the current focus of our work. And then finally, people say you're searching this huge space, you're trying all these different things. How do you know you're not just boiling the ocean and getting lucky and finding the model that kind of works? So this is something that the statisticians have been working on for years with multiple hypothesis testing. So incorporating that idea into our work, I think, makes all the sense in the world. So that's it. I'm happy to take questions on anything, and please feel free. Yeah?
Do you compress matrices? Do you decompress them to cache it with the CPU?
So do we compress matrices? That's going to depend on which size and shape you're talking about. So when we're doing our dense work, generally we're not compressing our matrices, at least not when we're doing the operations on them. With sparse matrices, we do CSR type encoding to get tighter stuff. Jean-Marie gave a talk yesterday about the sparse matrix support in MLlib, so I encourage you to check out that video if you haven't seen it.
Do you vectorize the operations?
So we vectorize the operations. We don't vectorize the communications. I mean, we vectorize the communications to the extent that we don't send a byte at a time. We send full objects. Does that answer your question? Yeah. So we take advantage of the built-in BLAST libraries to do vectorized operations whenever possible. Yeah.
So I think most of the methods that we are talking about is classified statistics. So if you consider methods like which consider a particular classifier, for instance, like you could have used like the entire path solution for some of the classifiers, and that would give you the entire path based on some initial.
For example, you can for some of these methods you can kind of get the regularization or the optimal regularization parameter for free. Rich regression is a good example of that. So we haven't incorporated that into this work, but that's a very natural thing to do. Absolutely. Yep.
Can you just comment on how much customization can be done to the model selection criteria at this point?
What do you mean by customization? Which Yeah, absolutely. So at the moment, the code is basically set up so that you can define a hyperparameter space as sort of an abstract thing. A set of hyperparameters and maybe nested, you can pick the search method that you want to use. The code is fairly simple, so if you wanted to try a slightly different search method, maybe vary the number of folds for a k-fold cross-validation, that would be fairly simple to do. Yep.
Do you have any insights on why certain search methods, particularly among the base maps we looked at, were performing better than others?
Yeah, so I don't. it was a little surprising that this spearmint method didn't work for us. We're in conversation with the authors on that one to figure out what the discrepancy there is. Between the SMAC and the TPE, which are the two search methods that seem to work really well in our hands. TPE is sort of simpler. It basically starts with a random search and then hones in on the area that seems to be giving it the most juice via basically setting up two distributions and sampling from the one that seems to have better performance. SMAC does a random forest-based approach, which my intuition is that would work better as you start to collect lots more data points. You just get sort of a more fine-grained view of the search space. But we're really operating in the regime where you've got low tens to maybe 100 data points to choose from. Yep, back there. Oh, sorry.
Optimizing using the CPU cycles while the CPU is idle otherwise waiting for memory.
Mm-hmm.
Does that affect the portability of your approach?
I don't think it really affects the portability. I mean, I think it's gonna, there's this concept called machine balance, which is basically the speed at which memory streams through versus the flops per core. And so that is something that has, you look at the numbers over the years, and it's been sitting around 25 for most modern CPUs. That said, if some new memory bus architecture comes out, or some Intel releases some new CPUs, that could change this balance number. But the trend has been actually towards more CPU per amount of memory transferred over the last few years. Yep, question.
So is there a possibility of contributing to the project? Is it already an open source project that is open for the public, or is it closed?
Yeah, so I fully encourage you to contribute to MLlib. That's sort of the main area of open source contribution right now with machine learning on Spark. That said, this particular model search project, we're hoping to have a public release out sort of near the end of the summer. It's going to depend on how some of our paper submissions go and that sort of thing.
So right now it's not available to the public?
No, not yet. Those upper level components. Yep. One more? Yeah.
Do you have any problems like machine models that fit well in the cache like that?
Yeah, I mean, so in this case, we've kind of tied our hands a little bit and said that we're going to take the features that the user gives us as input, and we're not going to yet focus on like how do we select those features or how do we enumerate new ones. And so the model size is almost always determined automatically by the size, the number of features that the user gives us. So if you're dealing with a really, really wide data set, for example, say hundreds of thousands of features, you might not be able to get some of the full benefits of some of the optimizations I talked about. But that's going to depend on your data. All right, great. I think being held off stage, thanks again.
I'll need glasses for this. Thank you. Oh, you know what? You gotta do the password first, I guess. Oh, you got it. You got the magic. We're all tech here. Okay, cool. So we'll get to the bottom. There you go. Awesome. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this particular talk. And my name is Santanu Das, and with me I have Debasish Das. He is also a co-author of this particular work. And we are actually from Verizon's lab, and we are located in Palo Alto. So before I jump into the slides, one point I'll try to make here is the contribution we are making here is more towards the MLlib and more specifically, it's towards the recommendation system. But while doing the work, we realized like this kind of contribution we just made can actually open up other avenues, like in terms of classification and detection. So what to expect from this talk? Primarily, we'll be talking a little bit about like what essentially matrix factorization is, and then more specifically, we will focus on the formulation for the non-negative matrix factorization. And in that context, we'll actually introduce two different kinds of algorithm to solve a particular quadratic minimization problem. Followed by that, we'll actually go through a few use cases, like we'll actually demonstrate the different constraints. Particularly, the interesting ones are the linear constraints, where we'll show sparsity bounds and equality constraints. And we'll actually end up the talk with some results and discussion. And at the end, we'll actually go with the QA. So from matrix factorization point of view, what essentially it means, suppose we have a rating matrix. What we essentially want to do is to get two metrics out of it. We want to decompose it in terms of two matrices. One of them is basically a user factor matrix. The other one is movie factor matrix in this case. And the equation we are seeing in this slide is a very generic one, where the first term is showing like we want to decompose the rating matrix in terms of the two factor matrices such that the reconstruction error is minimized. And at the same time, the second and the third term is fundamentally introducing sparsity on those two particular factor matrices. And the third term and the fifth term is essentially introducing some sort of smoothing factor. So this is the current state of the art in Spark right now. So it's basically the alternating least square method. In this particular technique, what we do is we fix one of the factor matrices at one time and then estimate the other one. And in that case, in that way, we actually repeat the whole method until convergence. What I want to point out here is, in the current Spark implementation, there are two different loops, the inner loop and the outer loop. In the inner loop, what we do is we basically get a tolerance-based solution, and in the outer loop, we actually repeat the same method until convergence. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is our contribution is more towards the inner loop, where we will show how to introduce more capability and advance the current state of the art. So we already know, like, non-negative matrix factorization is essentially clustering. So what we are doing here is we are solving an independent problem, and that's given by the equation below. And once we get those individual solutions, which is H1, H2 till Hn, we actually get the aggregated solution. And again, once again, our contribution here is introducing a quadratic programming solver, which is more in the inner loop side. We are still using the outer loop the way it has been implemented in Spark. So here we are introducing two different algorithms. One is ADMM, which is alternating direction method of multipliers, and the second one is SOCP, which is basically second order conic problem. And so what ADMM does is basically it's a divide and conquer kind of technique, where it decomposes a complicated problem into smaller sub-problem and finds out an effective way of solving it. And at the same time, at the end, it kinds of try to achieve some sort of consensus. That's a very high-level description of ADMM. And for ECOS, which is actually is an acronym of Embedded Conic Solver. So what it does, it solves like specific class of problems that can be expressed or formulated in terms of SOCP, and ultimately it will be solved using interior point method. So we actually did some very preliminary experiments, and what we saw is, in some cases, ADMM performs better, where the constraints are much simpler, but ECOS actually can handle very complicated kind of constraints. But again, I want to emphasize that these test scenarios will have to do more investigations in future. So from now onwards, I'm going to hand over the slides to Debasish, and he will run you through the rest of the presentation.
Thanks a lot, Shantanu. So the first one is the quadratic programming formulation written as ADMM. So we know that the objective function, as you can see, is a standard quadratic programming. But in this, we are trying to take the constraints. So in this particular slide, I am giving a very simple constraint, which is just positivity. And we are trying to make an ADMM formulation, which is the standard consensus formulation out of it. And you can see that there are 3 steps. One is your step to optimize H, and then the ZK. And the third step is the dual variable. So these are the standard steps. So you can look into the ADMM reference from Professor Boyd, and you can see these in action. This is how it looks like when you write it in Spark. So all you have to give it is that in your solve API, you give your gram matrix, and then you give your linear objective part. And after that, if your problem have equality, you specify that. If not, you don't have to. And then the standard solve, we do a direct solve right now. So we do a Cholesky, and after that, there is an ADMM loop. So the second slide shows you how does that ADMM loop looks like. I think the key point in this that which comes of Scala and Spark and the flexibility that we get. So it's this solve triangular is basically a triangular solver, which is called from BLAS. And thanks to Scala and then Breeze and Spark, we are calling the native Fortran code to get this triangular solve. So you get native runtime. And the third step, like the proximal step that you see is basically the second ADMM step, which takes your Z and puts it to a valid place where your constraints are satisfied. And then it's a very simple algorithm, and you loop till your X, Z, and U variable converges. Now, why did we have a SOCP formulation still? Because with this project, we are trying to bring the most standard constraint solver that is possible to Spark, and which means this will open up avenues to solve linear problems with linear constraints, quadratic problem with linear constraints, and you can also solve linear problem or quadratic problems with quadratic constraints. So this is SOCP formulation shows that how do we take a quadratic problem and translate it into a SOCP formulation. So what we do is we transform the problem into a quadratic constraint, and the main trick is that we do a Cholesky transformation in a way that the Cholesky factor transpose Cholesky factor will give us back this quadratic constraint, and then we take a square root of that, and we get back the quadratic constraint represented as a linear constraint. And this is the latest, I think, SOCP most likely is the most efficient linear solvers that is possible right now. So we did this to see that which problems need SOCP solver. Like if our problem has a very difficult constraint, we wanted to see how does the SOCP solver behaves as compared to the ADMM version. Now, in this code, you can see how do we implement a very basic SOCP solve. So in this, the API is a bit more complicated because you make your QP solver with how many gram matrix, what's the size of your gram matrix, and also by this, we make use of the Breeze compressed sparse matrix. So by this, you specify the structure of the equality constraints. The second one, you specify the structure of your inequalities. So this is like the complete formulation. So you can solve any problem, linearly constrained problem that you can. And after that, thanks to, again, Spark and Scala, so we are calling a native library, which is written in C. Now, why we are calling a native library in C is because to solve this, we need a sparse linear algebra. And right now on the JVM, there are no sparse linear algebra. So what we did was that there's Professor Tim Davis has his code, which we wrapped it up, and we call it through a native library. And we have not seen a very big runtime loss going from Scala to Java to native, very less runtime loss. So this is one way. Now I will show you some of the use cases of applying these. So first use case is that what if we have some positivity? So what we want is that all the factors should be positive. So this is very common for cases where you are doing feature extraction from photographs. So where you can't have your factors with negative numbers. So in the test, we are just showing some very basic proof of concept test that how different is the result from the octave. And we have found out is that almost all of them give you very similar answer, except that we got some purity, like more pure results with the ECOS and ADMM. This shows you the Spark code. So that's how we put it inside Spark MLlib recommendation. So the structure, if you are familiar with Spark code base, then you will see that there's minimal change. So all we are doing is that for H and F matrix, we have to derive them, and we send them to the QP solver, and we solve it. Now, this shows you what is the projection operator, which is the Z update. So you have to take the Z values, which came out of your ADMM algorithm, and you have to project it to a box, which means the lower bound is 0, upper bound is, say, 1 or 10. So you have to project it to that box, and this shows you how simple the code is to take and project the Z value into lower and upper bounds. The second use case is sparsity, which is L1 regularization. We don't have it in Spark yet, so this will be our major contribution. So in this, I'm just showing that where does the sparsity show up. So in some cases where we know the signal from which the problem came is a sparse signal, so we need to generate factors which are sparse. So that's one of our motivations to do this. And this is, again, some basic test to see that when we solve this problem with some, I think for this problem we put a regularization of 2, and this is a 25 factor. So the total latent factor we are finding is 25. And we are just trying to see that, is it true that how close are we to the octave? And we have found, so this is in alternating least square that Spark has. We cannot solve this. But what we have found is that our ECOS and ADMM solvers both give you sparse answers. Now, this is, again, how do we write this code in MLlib? So the ways to do is that you make a new direct solver, and you set that the proximal, what proximal operator do you want to make use of? In this case, it is an L1. And then we just put a lambda on this, so, and then you do the solve. Now, this is the Z, the proximal operator for L1 solve. So this comes from a paper from Rockefeller. Later, it has been used in ADMM papers. So this is called soft thresholding. So the code is very simple for this too. Now, the third use case, which is a bit more complicated, because in this we are not only doing, so we want to force a bound constraint on each of the factor, which says that each of the factor in your matrix factorization should be between 0 or 0, 1. But with that, we also want to force the summation of all the factors should be equal to C. In this case, we took C as 1. And then we just did some basic tests to see that if our result matches with Octave or not. So in this, again, ALS cannot solve this, but our results, both of them, ECOS and ADMM based, were very close to Octave. Now, this is again, is a bit more difficult because you have to specify the structure of your equality constraint. So the first one, you build a compressed sparse matrix, which shows you what kind of equality you want to force. And then you put a bound constraint. And then you make your QP solver. And after that, the solve technique is same. So you put this code into Spark, and then you just put the gram matrix part, the linear objective part, and you solve it. Now, in this slide, finally, I want to show you some of the runtime experiments we did. We took a movie lens data set, which comes with MLlib now, which has 1M ratings from 6,000 subscriber, 3,000 movies. Now, you see, the way to run the code is not very different than what you do right now. I did local testing just because I wanted to see how far are we in terms of runtime compared to the least square, which is the basic, the baseline. So the way to specify what kind of QP problem you want to solve is just an option. So we have right now 5 different versions of the problem that we can solve. So these 5 different versions are the basic quadratic minimization, which is least square. Then you can put positivity, so each factor should be larger than 0. Then you can put bounds, which means each factor should be between 0 and 10, say. Then you can put sparsity, that each factor, each out of the 25 latent factor you want, it should be within like only 4 factors you want to pick. And the third one is equality and bounds. So, in the runtime, the basic result is that for QP and QP with positive QP and bounds, our ADMM-based algorithm was at par with least square or slow, a bit slower than that, but we are much faster than ECOS-based interior point method. So what it says that if the constraints are simple, like QP or QP with bounds or QP with L1, then ADMM-based algorithm works really well. But on our QP equality, we found that SOCP solver or a interior point-based solver was giving us better runtime. So we are still trying to look into that. So our main goal is that if we can bridge the runtime and make it ADMM to make it as faster as ECOS. Now, future work, we want to put this inside Spark. So there has to be a lot of testing being done since a lot of new options will come in with this change. Also, the runtime optimizations that I showed, so we have to look into that. So what our main goal is that we should not be much slower than the baseline least square. But of course, we are solving much complicated problems. But still, we want to optimize as much as we can. We also want to look into the matrix factorization case where like the values are not considered missing, so that needs a gram matrix broadcast. I think last day we had a talk on this. We want to see how on our large scale data sets, does it scale, or do we need to do more changes? Now, the fourth one, I still need to talk with the community that does the community need a linear programming or a SOCP solver? So we do have the code. If the community needs, we can expose it. The fifth one is so all the solvers we wrote so far, they make a Cholesky factorization. So when your ranks are large, which is if you want to do a kernel version of support vectors, so your ranks can be pretty large. So for those, we want to come up with an iterative version of these solvers. And of course, we are going to do a lot of applications of these solvers to our data sets. And hopefully we will going to show a lot of these things in upcoming days. So from here, I can take questions. Yeah.
So it was not clear like how you utilized Spark here, because like I think the size you just have gram matrix.
Yeah.
So you really did not need to use any distributed Spark here, because like I don't see any distributed step in the derivations of the ADMM.
Oh no, ADMM is not distributed. So if you look at the Spark code base in MLlib recommendation, you will see a step like this. So that step, right? So matrix factorization problem, Spark distributes it to a way that every solve becomes a data local. Now our solver comes after that.
So basically, it's the compilation of the X transpose X matrix that you're doing here, which utilizes the Spark code.
Yes, so X transpose X comes from Spark, then we send it to our solver, get the answer back. Yeah. Sure.
So after 1.0, we put non-active release the Spark solver into ARS that's based on projected conjugate gradient.
Yeah.
So did you run some
Yes.
experiments against that? What's the
Yeah. So
comparison?
So right now, that's your QP positive. So right now, the ADMM version is around 6x slower as compared to that. So we are still looking into that. Why is this? Since our version of the code uses direct Cholesky factorization, while that version of the code does a conjugate gradient. So we are still looking into that. If we move our solver to the CG version, we should get back to the same kind of runtime.
What's the size of K here for this experiment?
25, you mean the rank?
Yes,
Yeah, the rank is 25 or this. And we will scale it more, yeah.
second question is, basically, if you want to promote sparsity, you don't need to put an L1 constraint. If you put a non-active constraint, it's already promote sparsity. Right?
Yes.
Compare the sparsity from the result between the positive constraint and L1 constraint.
We found very different answers, yeah. So since L1, when we put L1, we don't put positivity because that does not make sense, right? But we have found in our runs is that the X, like the L1 and positivity were giving different results, but I don't know how does that translate to the recommendation and the whole rest of the flow. So we have not done that experiment yet, but yeah, we will be doing that. So I think in literature, there has been a lot of work on sparse NMF. So we wanted to keep those features. Like if someone wants to make use of L1, he should be able to.
Have you been able to implement this ADMM over Spark?
Yes, yes. So we want to put the code back in. So we are still talking with our like legal and all, but the plan is to put the code back in. Yes. Yeah. I saw some else. Okay. Yeah.
Can I ask the size of the data that you used out here? Like,
So-
do you have any time evaluation or time analysis for the data that you
So this one, right? So that's the movie lens. That's the data set we made use of. This. Yes, but this problem was too small, so we did not want to see our large-scale data sets on it yet. So this was more like a standalone testing to see how far are we in terms of speed, since we want to be as fast as least square. So this testing is trying to move us to that place, and once we have this thing runs on distributed. We have tested that, but since we wanted to focus on the runtime of each local solve, so that's why I am not showing data on that.
And in the distributed one, would you say this algorithm performs similar to what they have for the?
Yeah, since it all scales, right? Since the Spark ALS will scale based on the number of cores you give. Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. That was excellent. We've got a break now. We'll see you after the break.